4. Whence those devices of sexual saturation, so characteristic of the space and the social rituals of the 19th century, of the 1800s. People often say that modern society has attempted to reduce sexuality to the couple, the heterosexual and, insofar as possible, legitimate couple. There are equal grounds for saying that it has, if not created, at least outfitted and made to proliferate groups with multiple elements and a circulating sexuality, a distribution of points of power, hierarchized and placed opposite to one another, pursued pleasures, that is, both sought after and searched out, compartmental sexualities that are tolerated or encouraged, proximities that serve as surveillance procedures and function as mechanisms of intensification, contacts that operate as inductors. This is the way things worked in the case of the family, or rather the household, with parents, children, and in some instances, servants. Was the 19th century family, was the 1800s family, really a monogamic and conjugal cell? Perhaps to a certain extent, but it was also a network of pleasures and powers linked together at multiple points and according to transformable relationships. The separation of grown-ups and children, the polarity established between the parents' bedroom and that of the children. It became routine in the course of the century when working-class housing construction was undertaken. The relative segregation of boys and girls, the strict instructions as to the care of nursing infants, maternal breastfeeding, hygiene, the attention focused on infantile sexuality, the supposed dangers of masturbation, the importance attached to puberty, the methods of surveillance suggested to parents, the exhortations, secrets, and fears, the presence, both valued and feared, of servants, all this made the family, even when brought down to its smallest dimensions, a complicated network, saturated with multiple, fragmentary, and mobile sexualities. To reduce them to the conjugal relationship, and then to project the latter, in the form of a forbidden desire, onto the children, cannot account for this apparatus which, in relation to these sexualities, was less a principle of inhibition than an inciting and multiplying mechanism. Educational or psychiatric institutions, with their large populations, their hierarchies, their spatial arrangements, their surveillance systems, constituted, alongside the family, another way of distributing the interplay of powers and pleasures, but they too delineated areas of extreme sexual saturation, with privileged spaces or rituals such as the classroom, the dormitory, the visit, and the consultation. The forms of a non-conjugal, non-monogamous sexuality were drawn there and established. 19th century, 1800s, bourgeois society, and it is doubtless still with us, was a society of blatant and fragmented perversion. And this was not by way of hypocrisy, for nothing was more manifest and more prolix or more manifestly taken over by discourses and institutions. Not because, having tried to erect too rigid or too general a barrier against sexuality, society succeeded only in giving rise to a whole perverse outbreak and a long pathology of the sexual instinct. At issue, rather, is the type of power it brought to bear on the body and on sex. In point of fact, this power had neither the form of the law nor the effects of the taboo. On the contrary, it acted by multiplication of singular sexualities. It did not set boundaries for sexuality. It extended the various forms of sexuality, pursuing them according to lines of indefinite penetration. It did not exclude sexuality, but included it in the body as a mode of specification of individuals. It did not seek to avoid it. It attracted its varieties by means of spirals in which pleasure and power reinforced one another. It did not set up a barrier. It provided places of maximum saturation. It produced and determined the sexual mosaic. Modern society is perverse, not in spite of its puritanism or as if from a backlash provoked by its hypocrisy. It is in actual fact and directly perverse. In actual fact, the manifold sexualities, those which appear with the different ages, sexualities of the infant or the child, those which become fixated on particular tastes or practices, the sexuality of the invert, the gerontophile, the fetishist, those which, in a diffuse manner, invest relationships, the sexuality of doctor and patient, teacher and student, psychiatrist and mental patient, those which haunt spaces, the sexuality of the home, the school, the prison, all form the correlate of exact procedures of power. We must not imagine that all these things that were formed tolerated, attracted notice, and received a pejorative designation when the time came to give a regulative role to the one type of sexuality that was capable of reproducing labor power and the form of the family. These polymorphous conducts were actually extracted from people's bodies and from their pleasures, or rather, they were solidified in them. They were drawn out, revealed, isolated, intensified, incorporated by multifarious power devices. The growth of perversions is not a moralizing theme that obsessed the scrupulous minds of the Victorians. It is the real product of the encroachment of a type of power on bodies and their pleasures. It is possible that the West has not been capable of inventing any new pleasures, and it has doubtless not discovered any original vices, but it has defined new rules for the game of powers and pleasures. The frozen countenance of the perversions is a fixture of this game. Directly. This implantation of multiple perversions is not a mockery of sexuality, taking revenge on a power that has thrust on it an excessively repressive law. Neither are we dealing with paradoxical forms of pleasure that turn back on power and invest it in the form of a pleasure to be endured. The implementation of perversions is an instrumental effect. It is through the isolation, intensification, and consolidation of peripheral sexualities that the relations of power to sex and pleasure branched out and multiplied, measured the body, and penetrated modes of conduct. And accompanying this encroachment of powers, scattered sexualities rigidified, became stuck to an age, a place, a type of practice, a proliferation of sexualities through the extension of power, an optimization of the power to which each of these local sexualities gave a surface of intervention. This concatenation, particularly since the 19th century, since the 1800s, has been ensured and relayed by the countless economic interests which, with the help of medicine, psychiatry, prostitution, and pornography, have tapped into both this analytical multiplication of pleasure and this optimization of the power that controls it. Pleasure and power do not cancel or turn back against one another. They seek out, overlap, and reinforce one another. They are linked together by complex mechanisms and devices of excitation and incitement. We must therefore abandon the hypothesis that modern industrial societies ushered in an age of increased sexual repression. We have not only witnessed a visible explosion of unorthodox sexualities, but, and this is the important point, a deployment quite different from the law, even if it is locally dependent on procedures of prohibition, has ensured, through a network of interconnecting mechanisms, the proliferation of specific pleasures and the multiplication of disparate sexualities. It is said that no society has been more prudish. Never have the agencies of power taken such care to feign ignorance of the thing they prohibited, as if they were determined to have nothing to do with it. But it is the opposite that has become apparent, at least after a general review of the facts. Never have there existed more centers of power, never more attention manifested and verbalized, never more circular contacts and linkages, never more sites where the intensity of pleasures and the persistency of power catch hold, only to spread elsewhere.